Hello, my name is David Pendergrass, the pastor of discipleship here at First Methodist West Chase. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope it's beneficial for you. I hope you've been enjoying your experience in DGroup. I hope as a DGroup leader you have felt it encouraging to you to see the growth that's taking place in your group. I hope by now that the group is starting to form some cohesion. You really know people's names. You're starting to get to know them a little better. You've planned some social events, some mission opportunities, and you're starting to form more like a family, like a D group's supposed to. I also hope by this time that people who have come into your D group are feeling welcomed, and they have an outline, they have a book, they have a Bible ready to go when they walk in the door if possible, and I hope that they're getting to know each other really well. Let's move on today to chapter 11. Chapter 11, the Psalms, Israel's prayers and ours. Now, the Psalms, the book of Psalms, is a collection of songs. We have, of course, here at the church, a Methodist hymnal. Almost every division of Christianity in the world has some kind of hymnal, a song book. That's what the Psalms were to the ancient Hebrews. It was their hymn book. That's all it was. In fact, it was a collection of 5 different hymn books put together. And those 5 different books got collated or put together centuries ago, but now for our benefit, we have all 5 books in one book. And you have here in my outline on page 22, chapters 1 to 41 are 41 different hymns, and then book 2 is 42 to 72, book 3, and so forth. And these psalms probably started both in private, or rather individual instances at the temple. Most psalms probably started that way with songs offered by the priest or the Levites. Levites are priest helpers. That's what they are. They help out with sacrifices and gathering the offerings and the tithes and so forth. The Levites, and maybe some degree the priests, and maybe a chorus, sang songs to God as they offered sacrifices, as they gave offerings. And of course, that trickled on to other worship experiences and eventually to the synagogue, where the Jews gathered together to offer worship to God. And so the Psalms probably started out orally, as it were, from the temple and moved to an en masse, or a group setting. And you can see that throughout the Psalms. You have some that are about sacrifice, some about going up to Zion or Jerusalem or the temple, and others have issues about war and so forth. But it is a song book. It is a song book. Because it is a song book, you'll notice a very common expression in the Psalms is a Psalm of David, a Psalm of David. In Hebrew, that's in the genitive case, or rather it's the of David part. That of David part in Hebrew is ambiguous. It can mean, like I say here in the note, a psalm authored by him, dedicated to him, about David, or it has a Davidic style, and so forth. So because it says Psalm of David doesn't mean he wrote it. No more than Book of Moses means that Moses wrote it. It's the exact same issue with Book of Moses. But it is likely that David wrote several of the Psalms for various reasons. Number 2, the Psalms primarily talk to God about God. To God about God. That is, they represent theology to God by the authors. They're not intended to teach doctrine, theology, moral behavior. They are expressions, and we'll say in a second, but poetic expressions of praise, lament, and so forth to God about God. They help us express joys and sorrows and success and failure and so forth. Now, misunderstanding this can have horrible consequences. If a Christian thinks the Psalms are meant to teach us how to live, that is, to give us moral instruction, we can really do some awful things. For example, in Psalm 137, 8-9, in the context, historical context, they had been deported to Babylon, and the Babylonians had crushed an enormous amount of Jews and killed them and their families. And the psalmist cries out to God and basically says, I wish their babies' heads were dashed against the rocks. Well, that text is not supposed to be moral instruction for us, of course. Certainly not as Christians. Rather, it demonstrates the enormous pain and sorrow they're going through, that, God, I wish you would get them because of what just happened. But this is really important. I hope you'll really score the support with your point with your D group, that these are theology poems. They're songs about God to God, almost entirely. and that they should not be read as moral instruction to us. They're like love notes that you picked up that are 2,000-year-old love notes from your grandparents or great-great-great whatever parents, and they're expressing love or sorrow or whatever toward God. They're not meant to teach us how to live. Thirdly, the genre of the psalm is a poem. Now that's easy for people with an English background or literature background to understand, but if it's not common for you, I want to make certain that you get this point, that poetry is deliberately full of metaphors, similes, hyperbole. Hyperbole is when you have an expression that's overly exaggerative to prove the point. Let's say it's raining cats and dogs. That's a metaphor, and it's hyperbole at the same time. And on, we have American English has an enormous amount of metaphors, similes, and hyperboles. The Psalms do that as well all the time. So it's really important that you and I not over-exegete. We don't need to read into the text more than what's there. Not in poetry. Not in poetry. This is not written to be prose or narrative. It's written to be poetry. And so we're always trying to ask the question, what is this language trying to express? Are they angry? Are they sad? Are they happy? What's the point they're trying to express? What's the emotional import they're trying to have? If you'll ask that question, then you'll be much more closer to finding out a proper interpretation of the text. Now, some things you'll find, because it's poetry, that are repeated often, and I mean often. One is parallelism. There's different kinds. There's synonymous parallelism, where each line means basically the same thing, and then they have contrasting parallelism and so forth. But in Psalm 19, 1-2, it says, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims His handiwork. Now, I've heard sermons and lessons most of my life that try to take these different lines and really try to get different deep meanings out of every other verse. Most of the time, that's wrong. This is just a form of poetry, a form inside of poetry called parallelism. When it says the heavens are telling the glory of God and the firmament proclaims His handiwork, it means the same thing. Because to an ancient person, the heavens, that is what we would call the sky, is hard. They call it a firmament. So when the heavens are declaring the handiwork of God, the firmament proclaims His handiwork. They've just said, the author has just said the same thing in two different ways. That's poetic parallelism, synonymous parallelism. The psalmist can also do the same thing if it's contrasting. But then they might contrast this verse to the one right beneath it to make a similar contrast and so forth. But oftentimes, just common sense will let you know. You don't have to have a PhD in Hebrew language to oftentimes just say they're being poetic. But I'm asking you not to read too much into it. Another thing that it's typically done that's incorrect when it comes to the Psalms is, again, misunderstanding them, that these are supposed to be songs to God about God, not moral instruction to us. They're not there to unveil deep theological truths. For example, in Psalm 51. In Psalm 51, which most people who grew up in the church are familiar with this one, it talks about David who feels very remorseful, and the compunction is hitting hard inside of him of the sin that he had committed toward God. In verse 3, he says, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you alone have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence, and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me." And he goes on from there. Now, Psalm 51 is not teaching us that babies are born in sin. It's not teaching us that conception is sinful, or that all conceptions are sinful, or that the mother was a sinner because she got pregnant. It's not talking about original sin. None of those things. This is a poetic description of probably King David, who feels very guilty. Very guilty. Secondly, of course, things such as against verse 4, "Against you, you alone have I sinned." Of course, David knows that that's not literally true. He sinned against Bathsheba. He sinned against Bathsheba's husband. He sinned against Bathsheba's whole family. He sinned against his own family himself because he dishonored them. David's very well aware he sinned against a whole bunch of people. But in poetic description, he's saying, now when I'm talking to you, God, it's very evident that I really screwed this up with you. So I highly encourage you not to read too much into this and over-exegete it and make it say more than it's trying to say. Now, if you want to have these theological beliefs about conception and sin and so forth, you need to find different texts in the Bible to support that. But the Psalms are not a good place to go to build brand new doctrinal statements on. Last but not least, on page 23, there's 7 major categories of the Psalms. And oftentimes it's helpful when we study them to know these different categories. And I'm not going to go to these in detail, but songs of lament. This is the largest group. Lament, of course, means when you cry out with anger or sorrow or pain towards God. And there's usually this pattern. There's a cry for help, and there's a cry for redress. So you tell them why you're upset, why you need things like health and so forth, and then there's confidence that they're going to get it. Now, I want to say a quick word about that. I hope you will look on pages 215 to 216 of your book and look on page Psalm 3 and compare the notes, and y'all talk about that as a D group. But I really hope that you'll help your D group members see that song lament is the most popular in the Psalms, but also oftentimes it's the most necessary. Encourage your people that when they're going through grief and sorrow to go to the Psalms as help. The Psalms are a wonderful place to help us express our grief to God. Many people, believe it or not, whether you believe this or not, many people do have a hard time expressing negative emotions toward God. Maybe because they had a parent or a parental figure who told them it's not good to think those things. It's not good. That's bad of you to think bad things toward God. It's bad of you. Unfortunately, that's false. That's not true. It's perfectly okay, and in fact, it's quite healthy to express toward God negative emotion. It's okay. So I want to encourage you that you have that permission based on the Bible, and you have permission. I also want your people in your group to feel the same permission, that it's okay to do that. Again, if you don't believe me, or if your person in your D group doesn't believe me, have them read the Psalms. Have them look up some of these lament Psalms and see if they feel any reticence of expressing their anger or grief toward God. It reminds me oftentimes of Mary and Martha in John 11 when Jesus goes to visit and Lazarus has died, and they cry out to Jesus, "Had you been here, this would not have happened." I can relate to that. And the second category is thanksgiving, of course, expressing gratitude and joy, psalms of praise for salvation history. That's what God has done through history. 5, celebration and affirmation, and about renewing the covenant, or royal psalms when a king was enthroned. Much like today, let's say if we wrote brand new songs every time there was an election. Every time there's a new president, we wrote a song, and America had a brand new presidential enthronement song. They did that back then as well, and some of those psalms are still here. Or psalms that just celebrate Jerusalem. Then wisdom psalms that celebrate and praise wisdom, and then psalms of trust. Now, it's possible for psalms to include elements of all of these, not all necessarily, but 1 or 2 or 3 in one psalm. Many scholars would argue it's because these psalms might have circulated originally as independent psalms, but eventually were joined together. But nevertheless, you'll find sometimes elements of these different 7 categories into one psalm. I'm going to say one quick word about the word hate. It shows up in the Bible oftentimes, and certainly in the Psalms. The word hate in Hebrew, and also when it shows up in the Greek in the New Testament, is typically misunderstood. It can mean despise. We might say, or the way we use it today, I hate so-and-so. There's an emotional and psychological vitriol. I despise them. It can mean that, but typically it doesn't. Typically, it is negative. It's a negative thing, but typically it means something like to be unwilling or unable to put up with. Or other times, the word reject is a good synonym. Reject. Again, so it's a strong word, but it doesn't, the emphasis is upon the rejection more than it is upon this emotional or psychological feeling I have. So if God hates someone, or the person says, I wish you'd hate them too, or I hate them too, it is a strong emotion, but it's much more about just, I want to get away from them. And it's an issue of rejection. The last few tips here on the Psalms, and then we'll wrap up. Again, the Psalms serve as a guide to worship. They help us how to think of how to write songs to God. And they teach us how to write songs that are well crafted. And you'll see, much like today, there are songs today typically follow some kind of pattern of verse, chorus, 2 times and it's over. Or if it's a modern praise song, it might be verse, chorus, 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 chorus. I'm just kidding. But it depends on the make of the song. But the Psalms typically follow a pattern as well. And if you get your mind around this pattern, it'll help you interpret the Psalms even better. And secondly, like I said, it helps us express our emotions to God. Joy, peace, love, worship, thanksgiving, all these things are expressed in the Psalms. And third, they demonstrate the importance of reflection and meditation on things that God has done for us. I love the Psalms that speak about God rescuing the Jews from Exodus, from slavery, and so forth. It celebrates what God has done for them, and it's important for us to do that as well. Now, this particular lesson, though it's only a few pages long, it has a lot to do in it because I listed several Psalms to discuss. So again, use your wisdom. You might not have time to cover all the Psalms. That's okay. Maybe you pick a few. Maybe you just pick one, like a song of lament and a song of praise or whatnot, and have people read just a few lines from each Psalm or something like that. But all that to say, I hope you do take some time to look up as many Psalms as you can and keep pointing out these particular features in your D group for your people. And don't forget, of course, you have notes at the very end of the outline, and to use those at the end of the chapter. And each week, if you need to, start next week and pick up where you left off. Encourage your people this week to read a Psalm or two. Read a Psalm every day. Maybe they can find one Psalm from every category and pick out one every day. And you could do the same thing and come back and talk about how rewarding that was. God bless you. I hope this D group coming up for you is blessed and wonderful, and you continue to grow together in mind, heart, and body.